What's up, YouTube? So early May, I posted a mock-up of Dragon Racing from How to Train Your Dragon 2 by John Powell, and I got a lot of questions on what instruments did I use, how did I balance them, how did I get it to sound the way it did. So I decided I'd do a two-part series on this piece. The first part, this video, is going to be just about the mock-up. What instruments I used, how I balanced them, and what you can use to make your mock-up sound more realistic. The second part of this series is going to be just analyzing the harmonies, orchestration, what you can take away in your own pieces from John Powell's amazing work. So let's get into it. So here we are. Here's the How to Train Your Dragon 2 mock-up up here. This is just my normal template that I just put everything into. So I'm not using all of these tracks. This is just, and I'll have another video on it, but that's just my template. But I'm just gonna start going through, and we start with the strings. The first thing that I noticed when writing in the strings for this is the way that he writes and orchestrates things. It's incredible. I think the number one rule, and I know I wasn't gonna talk about this, but the number one rule for good mock-ups is good orchestration. If it doesn't sound good in your mock-up, it probably is not orchestrated very well, and it won't sound good with the real orchestra were it to be played by one. So I think that's just number one rule, is orchestration is key. So the strings I'm using are Spitfire Symphonic strings. I'm not really doing much with them. There's some EQ on it, but just for programming wise, they're just all doing spiccatos, and they are quantized exactly. They are just all doing the same velocity. Not the strings themselves, but each group. I just have them locked in. What you want to do is something like this. You want to spend time in finding the right velocity. I have found that most of the time, you don't need to humanize the velocity. Players, especially when you have 60 string players, they are going to be on that beat pretty on and keep the same velocity pretty much all the way through. There's not going to be that much difference, and your sample library did not sample the minuscule velocity that they would do. So really, I know most people say don't, but you can pretty much, I always just put the velocities to 1, except for very minuscule stuff. Sometimes you want the drive, so let me just play this. You get, you need that pulse. That's very good to add in, that sort of stuff. But when you're just doing these little ostinatos here, it doesn't really matter. And I mean, other than finding the velocities that were good for that, that's pretty much all I did for programming wise. It's just balance is key. Balance is key. Now let me show you the brass here. Something that is very important when programming brass, and what I find to be the hardest. When you're doing long notes like these, not staccatos, but the more long melodic stuff, modulation is very important. Look at all the modulation I have on this brass. And what that allows to do is just be like a real player. You see how we accentuated that first note and brought it down. I don't accentuate this, I accentuate it at bar 6 again. And that's just because that's how a conductor would want it, that's how I wanted it, that's how the reference track, being the actual movie track, wanted it, and that's how natural players would do it. You really want to feel like, okay, how would this feel? And you want to just ease the modulation in. One of the hardest things for me to program was this horn part. Right, and the reason why that was so hard, symphonic brass, I love the symphonic series, I love Spitfire, but symphonic brass, very difficult to program. I spent a lot of time trying to move these notes back and forth. You see, nothing is really quantized, just the way the samples are, and I mess around with the velocities for hours, and that's another important thing. You just gotta take the time. That's the second thing, there we go. Number one is balance. Number two is take the time to get it right. If you just take the time and figure it out, learn your samples, it's going to be a lot better than if you're just like, oh, I can't figure this out. Figure it out. Promise. I promise you, it'll be worth it. And there's no modulation going on here, except for this last bit, because these are all marcato tenuto samples that don't use modulation. Which means my next thing is articulation. What I love about Logic, and Cubase has this as well, not sure about Studio One or others, they have articulation sets. So I'm using different articulations for everything here. So like that's marcato, that's tenuto, that's staccato, and that just gives you that different variation between everything. You want to use different articulations to get the right sound. Also, another thing is just layering. If you need it, layer it. This is 6 horns, and just for this one little bit, I layered Angry Horns from Angry Brass Performance Samples, which is completely free, would 100% recommend. We'll put the link in the description. But I just layered it for this one bit, because I couldn't get the Spitfire horns to give me that sound. Here's just with Spitfire. But layered with Angry Brass, just for that one little bit. The other things going on here are the trumpets. You see the trumpets just have this little Once again, there's nothing fancy going on here. I just took the time to figure out the right velocities, to move the notes around. See, this isn't exactly quantized because the marcato sample is a little bit behind, so just finding the exact spot for that to be right on that beat. It's still even, it's not great, but in the mix, it sounds fine. Once again, layer where you need to. You see, I brought the A6 trombones in for this last bit just to give me this power here. Because I couldn't get it without it. If it was just the two here, the A6 trombones really just brought it out. So layering is key. Moving on to the second part. Let me show you what I did for the choir here. So we're in this part now. And my computer is sort of jumping in and out because of all the RAM and processing. Don't worry about it. Here is the choir. I will just solo it. Look at all the modulation. This took me not a very long time, but I took the time and I figured out all the modulation that it needs to do. Especially since this is Lacrimosa choir. The release samples on it are not very good. In order to get that diminuendo that would naturally happen, I had to program all of that in. But yeah, it sounds pretty decent. Especially in context. But another thing, it's not very exposed, so it's okay. The second part I could have done a much better job programming. I still have all the modulation, but most of this is quantized. But once again, since it's not exposed, I didn't spend too much time on it. But you can hear it now. Now that little soprano line I did spend time on because that had to come out. So if you see the modulation comes up to it and we hit that peak point and we come back down, right? And we hit that peak point and we come back down. Right? It's just little stuff like that that's really just gonna make or break your mock-up. That humanizing factor, that realism factor is really going to help. Here as well, so look at all the modulation. That's in my strings and everything. And here's the strings part. Right, and let me show you what the winds are doing here. Once again, look at all the modulation. You gotta go in. This part here didn't really do much modulation, I have to admit. Right, when it was really exposed is when you need all that modulation. Little thing of the orchestration I was talking about, look at all the space. Look at the space that you have. Everything is spread out. You can sort of see pretty much every part. So space is huge. And we'll talk about the orchestration, but space is huge in helping your mock-up as well. And here's the last part. Ready? Not much going on here. I'm doing a lot with velocity here because this is mostly spiccatos. See, here's the strings. Same velocities, and then you just sort of go up at that very end. But that's... not much going on, just spiccatos, but just finding that balance between all your instruments. And same with, I mean, woodwinds aren't really doing anything that's special either. And that's the mock-up The hardest parts to program were like these melodic bits and everything. And I mean, other than that, we just have some percussion going on. And a big thing with percussion, that's one time where humanizing is very important. You want the velocities to be a little bit different, and you also want it to be a little bit off, because I mean, when you have 60 string players, pretty much they're gonna be on, like, just you average it out, they'll be on that beat. But when you're having like one solo player on drums, when you have 5 players on drums, they're not all going to be on the same beat. You're going to hear a little bit, very minor flam, so you can hear what I did here. See how everything is sort of off, just a little bit. This sort of helps that realism. And one more thing, at the beginning of this intro, I just have this, you can use a sub bass. This is trailer brass from Keep Forest, and I just have it covering the tuba. And this is less important if you're just doing concert work, but for film work, you really need to fill out the whole spectrum. Alright guys, that's pretty much it. MIDI mockups are an art form. It takes time to perfect and get it to the place where you really want them to sound. You really just gotta work on it. There's not one trick that someone can tell you that's going to completely make your mock-up sound amazing. It's just not gonna happen. But you just gotta remember the 3 main things. Orchestration is key. Orchestration and balance. If your piece isn't balanced or orchestrated correctly, it's gonna sound weird, it's gonna sound awkward to a listener's ear. The second one is just learn your samples and take the time. Really just take the time to get the velocities right, to do the modulation and balance everything, because that's really going to help you. And learn your samples, learn the samples that you have. That's just gonna boost your mock-ups once you really know how to use those samples. Third, realism. Think, what would a real player do? What would this sound like with the real orchestra? If you're trying to program something and it's sounding awkward, before you're like, oh, I need a new sample, this sounds weird. No, maybe it's orchestrationally flawed. Maybe it's not written correctly. Maybe you should, instead of the horn playing this, you should give it to the flute, because it's the horn's overpowering the strings and whatnot, depending on your piece. Try to rewrite it and see why it might be awkward, because it's probably not the mock-up, it's probably the orchestration. Alright, so thank you for watching today's video. Make sure to like and subscribe and become a part of the process.